Between 1960 and 2023, the continent of Africa received approximately $1.3 trillion in total net official development assistance, ODA, in nominal terms. To put that figure into perspective, it is roughly equivalent to the entire current gross domestic product of a major European nation like Netherlands. Yet, data indicates that during the height of these transfers, progress on poverty stalled. In fact, between 1970 and 1998, Africa's share of the world's extreme poor rose from roughly 11% to 52%, while the continent's internal poverty rate climbed to 59%. While the extreme poverty rate in Africa has declined from its 1990s peak to roughly 38%, the total number of people living in poverty has nearly doubled since the aid era began. Furthermore, the economic divide between Africa and Western Europe has grown drastically. In 1950, the average Western European was roughly 8 times wealthier than the average African. But today, that gap has widened to more than 20 times. Current data from the International Energy Agency, IEA, and the World Bank confirms that approximately 600 million people in Africa, over half the continent's population, still lack access to electricity, with the absolute number remaining largely unchanged over the last 5 years due to rapid population growth. This presents us with a profound economic paradox that challenges the conventional wisdom of development economics. The prevailing narrative in the West has long been that poverty is simply a lack of capital, and therefore, the solution is the transfer of capital. However, a growing body of institutional analysis suggests that the transfer of capital without the correct economic mechanism is destructive. This video is an analysis of why financial aid has historically failed to deliver growth, and the lesson it teaches us about leverage and independence. To understand the failure in Africa, we must first analyze the one historical instance where foreign aid actually worked: the Marshall Plan. Following World War II, the United States transferred $13.3 billion, equivalent to approximately $170 billion today, to rebuild Western Europe. While this aid contributed significantly to the recovery, economists estimate that industrial production in recipient countries surged by 35% to 40%, contributing to a broader gross national product (GNP) increase of roughly 15% to 25% during the program's 4-year lifespan. This success convinced policymakers that the same model of large-scale capital injection could be replicated in the developing world. However, economists note a critical distinction. Europe required reconstruction of existing institutions, while Africa required the development of new ones. This brings us to the core argument presented by institutional economists regarding the political economy of dependence. In a functional economy, a government is funded primarily by the tax revenue collected from its own productive citizens. This creates a critical feedback loop. The government must provide an environment where citizens can produce value, or the tax revenue ceases. When a state receives the majority of its operating budget from foreign sources, this feedback loop is severed. The government no longer relies on the productivity of its people for survival. It relies on maintaining relationships with external donors. We observe a similar phenomenon in individual finance, often referred to as the lottery winner's curse. When capital is acquired without the corresponding struggle to earn it, the recipient often lacks the management skills required to deploy it effectively. It is not merely a moral failing, it is a structural reality. Money without a system for management is rarely retained. By the 1990s, foreign aid reached extreme levels of influence, financing at least 50% of the total government budgets in nations such as Uganda and Mali, and exceeding 60 to 80% of their development and investment spending. This created an incentive structure where the political class often prioritized donor relations over domestic economic management. Consequently, research published by the World Bank suggests that in highly aid-dependent countries, approximately 7.5% to 11% of aid is diverted to offshore bank accounts, while broader estimates from the African Union and Transparency International suggest that systemic leakage and corruption can siphon off as much as 25% to 30% of a nation's potential development resources. However, corruption is only the visible symptom. The more dangerous economic impact is a phenomenon known as the Dutch disease. This is an economic principle describing how a massive influx of foreign currency can inadvertently destroy a nation's domestic industries. When billions of dollars in aid enter a developing economy, they must be converted into local currency to be spent on goods and services. This massive influx of foreign capital increases demand for the local currency, artificially driving up its value on the foreign exchange market. While a strong currency might seem positive, it makes the nation's exports significantly more expensive for international buyers to purchase. This phenomenon renders local industries uncompetitive globally, creating a dependency on imports and destroying the domestic manufacturing base. We can observe a concrete example of this in the Ghanaian textile industry between the years 1980 and 2000. Data indicates that during this period of high aid flows and cheap imports, over 80% of domestic textile factories were forced to shut down. Local manufacturers simply could not compete with the influx of free or subsidized goods entering the market, leading to mass deindustrialization. Consequently, over the last 2 decades, manufacturing's share of the African economy has stagnated, hovering around 10 to 13% of GDP. While the broader industrial sector's share of GDP remains around 25%, most of this growth is driven by mining and extractive industries, rather than diversified factory production, leading to concerns that Africa is deindustrializing before achieving mature industrialization. To fully grasp the magnitude of this missed opportunity, we must compare this trajectory with the nations that took the opposite path. In 1960, the average income in South Korea was roughly equivalent to, and in some cases lower than, the average income in Ghana. However, over the next 40 years, South Korea transformed into an industrial powerhouse, while Ghana remained largely dependent on aid and raw materials. The critical difference was that the Asian titers prioritized an export-led model, deliberately keeping their currencies undervalued to boost global sales. They understood a fundamental rule of sovereignty: you cannot consume your way to wealth, you must produce your way to wealth. Instead of relying on transfers of wealth from abroad, they focused on building the internal capacity to create value that the rest of the world wanted to buy. South Korea used aid only as a temporary bridge, rapidly phasing it out, whereas in many African nations, aid became a permanent fixture of the budget. This forced the Asian governments to foster a private sector capable of competing globally, aligning the incentives of the state with the success of its businesses. This brings us to the uncomfortable reality of the current system. If the data on this failure is so clear, why does the model persist? Institutional analysis suggests that the persistence of this model is not due to a lack of knowledge, but due to the incentives of the aid industry itself. Reports from the Center for Global Development have indicated that a significant percentage of aid funding is absorbed by administrative costs and foreign contractors. This creates a closed ecosystem, where the primary metric of success is the amount of money disbursed, rather than the economic independence achieved. We must be clear, this is not an indictment of charity, but an indictment of a system that prioritizes dependency over structural reform. The lesson here is universal. Whether for a nation or an individual, capital that is not supported by a productive system will eventually be lost. This macroeconomic failure provides a critical blueprint for your own financial life. You cannot rely on external factors to secure your sovereignty. Just as these nations failed because they lacked a framework for wealth preservation and growth, many individuals fail for the exact same reason. Without a personal operating system for your capital, you are susceptible to the same forces of inflation, mismanagement, and dependency. This is why I curated 150 financial lessons for building wealth. It is not a collection of get-rich-quick tips. It is a comprehensive constitution for your financial life, designed to provide the discipline and strategic clarity that is often missing from the aid model. If you want to build a financial foundation based on first principles rather than hope, you can find the book on Amazon by scanning the QR code or clicking the link below. Now, having established the failure of the aid model and the necessity of a productive system, we must look at the future of the continent. The path to prosperity does not lie in increased donations, but in the rejection of dependency and the embrace of trade, innovation, and governance. Beyond the distortion of currency and industry, there is a third, less visible distortion that is equally damaging: the distortion of human capital. In many aid-dependent economies, the salaries offered by international aid agencies significantly outpace what the local government or private sector can afford. This creates a scenario where the brightest minds in the country are incentivized to work in the administration of aid, rather than in the creation of enterprise. Instead of engineers building factories or entrepreneurs solving local problems, the talent pool is absorbed into writing reports for foreign donors. This mismanagement extends to physical infrastructure as well, often resulting in what development economists refer to as white elephant projects. Donors often prefer to fund the construction of tangible assets like hospitals or dams, but rarely fund the long-term operational costs to maintain them. Without a robust local tax base to fund maintenance, these multi-million-dollar projects often fall into disrepair within a decade of their completion. This cycle of construction and decay is the direct result of an economic model based on external grants rather than internal return on investment. Private investment capital operates differently. It demands a return, which forces the project to be economically viable and self-sustaining from day one. This distinction explains why the recent influx of Chinese infrastructure investment, despite its own controversies, has arguably delivered more tangible utility. While often criticized as a debt trap, This model is at least predicated on trade and infrastructure development, rather than pure humanitarian relief. However, true sovereignty for the continent will not come from swapping one external patron for another. It will come from breaking the colonial trade pattern. The colonial pattern is simple: export raw materials at a low price, and import finished goods at a high price. This system ensures that the vast majority of the wealth creation happens outside the continent, regardless of how much aid is sent to compensate. The solution, therefore, is not more charity, but the development of local processing and manufacturing capacity to capture that value at the source. Economic history demonstrates that no nation has ever become wealthy solely through the export of raw commodities or the receipt of foreign aid. Wealth is the result of economic complexity, the ability of a society to organize itself to produce high-value goods and services. This requires the unglamorous work of lowering trade barriers between African nations, which are currently among the highest in the world. It is a statistical fact that it is often easier for an African country to trade with Europe than with its own neighbor, due to bureaucratic friction. Unlocking this internal market through free trade areas would generate more sustainable capital than any amount of foreign assistance. We are seeing glimpses of this potential in the rising tech hubs of Lagos and Nairobi, where private capital is funding solutions for local problems. This reinforces the central thesis of our analysis: capital follows competence, and wealth follows value creation. Organic economic growth is slow, difficult, and messy, but it is resilient. Artificial growth fueled by aid is fast, clean, but fragile. When the external funding stops, the aid economy collapses. The production economy, built on the capability of its citizens, endures. This leads us to the sovereignty paradox. To truly help a nation, you must sometimes be willing to stop saving it. Because the safety net of aid, while well-intentioned, often removes the urgency required to undertake painful but necessary structural reforms. It is only when the external lifeline is removed that a system is forced to face its own inefficiencies and build the capacity for self-reliance. And this brings the lesson back to you. The macroeconomics of a continent are simply the microeconomics of the individual writ large. If you build a life dependent on the generosity of an employer, a government, or a family member, you are subject to the same vulnerabilities. True sovereignty is not about how much money you receive. It is about your capacity to produce value and the systems you have built to retain it. The history of economic development suggests that necessity is often the mother of industrialization. When the option of waiting for a transfer is removed, the energy of a society shifts inevitably toward the creation of tradable value. We must understand that wealth is not a static resource to be distributed, but a dynamic result of efficient systems and productive effort. Whether for a continent like Africa or for your own household, the path out of poverty is never found in a donation, but in a system. It requires the construction of an engine, be it a manufacturing sector or a personal investment portfolio, that generates value independent of external goodwill. The data is clear. Nations that trade prosper. Nations that produce thrive. And nations that rely on aid, stagnation. The ultimate lesson is that sovereignty is expensive. It costs discipline, it costs reform, and it costs hard work. But it is the only thing worth buying. If you are ready to pay that price and build your own system, the resources are available. The choice to move from dependence to independence is yours. Since you've stuck around till the end of this video, it's clear that you found this analysis intriguing. I think you'll definitely want to check out the videos popping up on your screen now. They explore even more fascinating topics in finance that might just challenge your perspective. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more videos that break down complex and foundational topics in finance. Thanks for watching.